Okay, guys, so here we are. Surprisingly, we haven't talked about this topic too much. It seems to be always in fashion. We're going to talk about, well, a derivative of fat loss. We're going to talk about mini cuts. Um, we're going to go over who should mini cut, when you should mini cut. Is it essential to your progress? I think that's a big one, because everyone's just always anxious to use all the tools that they have access to. And yeah, we're going to clear it up a little bit, and hopefully, people can kind of connect us to their situation. Do any of you two guys have any sort of, I guess, recently upgraded topics or changes of opinion on this topic?
Me, I'm much less quantifiable, I guess you might say. Used to be I wanted people to track their macros, and I wanted to program like a specific rate of loss during their mini cut, whether it be 2 weeks or 6 weeks, But shoot, as of late, especially in light of like recent podcasts where we talked about appetite manipulation, tracking without tracking, and transitioning away from tracking. I've been using more of intuitive ways of doing mini cuts, just using lower fullness levels or maybe one less meal or, just less quantifiable ways and just more intuitive ways. And that's kind of been something new here for me recently, within like probably the last 6 months.
So when someone's cutting, like obviously they were bulking or gaining probably without tracking as well, you'd say, right? Typically?
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, exactly. And it's like, okay, if we're going to mini cut now, let's at least do a little audit of how you're feeling. Let's get in touch with how are you feeling? How full are you after your meals? How many meals are you eating? What kind of foods are you eating? Because there's some things that are going to happen when you're doing things a little bit more intuitively that could be the demise, of your mini cut. For example, if we're going to go, okay, let's eat to lower fullness levels. Well, if you start eating junkier food to those lower fullness levels, you're actually not taking in less calories, So we got to get a little audit, and then we'll kind of do things a little bit more. Because it's amazing to me. Sometimes people are like, I don't really ever pay attention to how full I am.
Yeah.
I just eat XYZ, carbs, fat, protein, and then I forget about it and go about the rest of my day until, the next meal comes out, And then once we get away from tracking, it's kind of like, well, I don't really know how full I am, So I just kind of like to get in touch with those things, and then, like I said, that's kind of been something I've been dabbling with. And it right now, especially, it's sometimes there's success and, sometimes there's not. But the one thing that I'm always gaining is knowledge. Why was it not successful? Why was it too successful? What worked, what didn't work, and so that's kind of been something that I've been dabbling with, here as of late.
Yeah, the fat loss intermissions, I think there are it's something we have to take the time to like build into a long-term plan, because, there's a lot of small print that comes with a fat loss phase. It's like the exact opposite of a gaining phase. So, so these, whether they're mini or not, these cuts, I guess, right? They're a great way to teach an athlete a number of different tools, and just to keep them sharp when it comes to certain aspects as well. Jeff, how about you?
Yeah, I think for me, like the way I think about them, I think has changed. I kind of look at mini cuts as a tool, like a tool that can be used for many uses. So in a sense, it has a lot of utility, and depending on the individual and the context around the individual, if a mini cut is actually appropriate or not appropriate. So as a coach, I'm very selective as far as who I'm going to use this tool for and the situation. And what's interesting is that I had a Skype today, and I actually planned a mini cut for someone. I'm like, oh, how useful, because we're recording a podcast on this tonight. So for this gentleman, basically, we're running a cut, and this is coming off of like 6 or 7 months worth of gaining. And it was like something that I was a little hesitant about programming just because his history prior to working with him, he was cutting quite often and not, let's say, appropriately. So we worked on, the last 6, 7 months of actually keeping him away from deficits to actually, have him in an environment where he can actually benefit from actually maybe gaining some muscle. And he was also kind of like Brad is doing, like kind of getting people away from being so quantifiable with tracking and all that. So this person was actually tracking to a T. So we kind of got away from the tracking. And the way we set this one up, this cut, that was one thing we talked about. Is that, okay, if we're gonna program this Minicut, we want to program how long we're going to do it, and actually how we're going to do the system. As far as, okay, we're going to go from X weight to X weight, but how are we going to get there? Like, what kind of tool we're going to use to quantify like the actual progress? Because there has to be some type of system in place, whether it's, hey, I'm tracking 100% of the time, I'm tracking 80% of the time, or I'm just using intuition. That's based off of kind of like your daily habits that's kind of led up to this point. So that was something that we discussed pretty much in depth. And, he really wanted to make this like not over the top rigid, but a little more rigid. And the reason we kind of said, okay, let's go ahead and track again is because in the future, this person's going to contest prep. So in a sense, this is kind of like a preseason game for that contest prep. So we're going to learn some skills as far as like how we're going to program this Minicut's going to mimic more so like what a contest prep would look like. So again, there's a lot of context, but that's kind of what goes through my mind when I think Minicut. It was like, okay, what's the context around each individual, and does it make sense on paper to do it? So anyways, that's kind of long-winded. I'm sure we'll continue to dive in, but that's kind of right off the top what I kind of think about Minicuts as far as the new way I kind of do things.
Yeah. I'd say the majority of people out there, they probably identify with their biggest issues. They probably gain weight / fat at a rate that is, they wish it wasn't that way. Right. And it's funny because as much as like a lot of our athletes, people we've worked with, like, say a friend of theirs like wants to start getting into shape, they would direct them right away into like, hey, you got to lift weights. Don't worry too much about the weight loss, the fat loss, because, a progressive, strength training within the confines of a high protein diet with enough calories is going to do more to change like your body than anything else will. Right. And it just so happens that a lot of the people we get, it's like, they'll probably say that to their friends, but by the time we get them, it's there's been like 8 bots, like cuts that have happened, and they feel that if they just sign on with us, that okay, this is how we're going to get it done, and quite often, if anything, like we're trying to get them away from that trauma long enough. I think one, so they could see the magic of like bodybuilding, right? Emphasis on the building, and then clear their heads, so that we can then, when it's appropriate, when we think they've checked off all the boxes where it's like, okay, now it's time to cut, now we go with it. So I think fat loss phases just in general, I think they're overly used and abused when it comes to people, trying to look their best.
Well, this specific person, basically prior to working with him, like I said, he was cutting quite often,
Yeah.
and he basically got so into the tracking that is probably obsessive. So removing him from that was one thing he did say that he learned over the last 6 or 7 months, was to actually learn to embrace his body now for what it is now, and he's more at peace with how he's looking, more with a heavier body weight, a little bit softer, but yet he's okay with it because on the training side of things, his strength has elevated over the last 6 or 7 months. And he's learned a thing or two about that as well. He learned that, okay, I don't need to do as much volume as he was doing because we kind of toned that down a little bit. So he's been learning a lot over the last 6 months, being away from the deficit. And not to mention, he's probably put on some muscle, but we're really going to find out exactly what's under the hood once we kind of take them through the fat loss phase, and we can kind of see, okay, this is the result of, you know, an 8-9 month process.
Jumping on something, Brad? That you want to say something there?
You know, just I think probably one of the things that I do with Minicuts, because like Jeff said, Minicuts are basically a tool, right? And there's a lot of different ways that you can get the job done. But at the end of the day, it's still a tool. And a lot of times with Minicuts, you don't necessarily have to have, you know, a goal in mind, or at least a definitive, tangible goal. Now, I'm not going to say this for all cases because it depends, you know, because I mean, some people I do have a definitive goal. Let's lose a pound a week for 5 weeks, you know, and sometimes I do have them track, you know, and those people do like to track. But one of the things that I start doing when we have a specific kind of a goal in mind as far as weight gain goes is I will use Minicuts to kind of slow down that rate of gain and stretch it out over a longer period of time. So, you know, let's say, for example, that, well, I'll just use myself as an example. You know, I say that I want to get from sub 200 pounds and I want to push to 212, right? Well, we all know how to start gaining weight, you know, and we can do it quantifiably, or we can just do it more on our hunger signals. But if I say that my goal is to be 212, but I want to take a long time to do that, I'll just pick a point halfway and just do a 4 to 6 week Minicut with really no real tangible or definitive numerical goal in mind. You know, I mean, as far as weight loss or pounds lost or whatever, I'm just trying to slow down the time that it takes to get from sub 200 to 212, right? So I'll kind of just keep gaining until I'm about 207, 208, something like that. Then it's like, okay, you know what? Let's do a Minicut right now. Let's slow this down a little bit. Really not, you know, enough time to inhibit progress, though. You know, sometimes when you do a little bit of a Minicut, it's like you almost get a little bit of a growth spurt in your strength, you know, because I don't know, maybe you can touch on that, Berto. I don't know why that is, but sometimes when people do Minicuts, they actually seem to perform a little bit better in the gym, and sometimes their strength actually goes up. But then once I complete that Minicut, regardless of how much weight I lose, let's say that I just go on a 4 or 5 week Minicut, it's back on the road to 212, you know? And then sometimes, you know, at least the few people that I've done this with, sometimes we make it to the goal. Sometimes we don't, you know? Sometimes people just don't like how they look when they start getting closer and closer to that goal of call it building, right, to 212. And that's fine, you know, and then we'll kind of start going the other way, and we'll kind of start thinking more of an extensive fat loss phase. But yeah, that's just kind of something that I've been using. I mean, I would say I do that for almost all my competitive bodybuilders, you know, the guys and gals that want to look better on stage the next time that they compete. You know, as it's like, we're going to have to get you at some point to a place where you're a little bit uncomfortable probably with your body. But we ain't going to get there tomorrow, you know, and I really don't want to get there in like 2 or 3 months, but here's what we can do, and we can have this nice long plan of how we're going to accomplish that. And then sometimes, you know, we make it, sometimes we don't, but it almost always ends up being that we made some definitive, you know, I guess subjective because they're by pictures, but there's a different look is the bottom line. It's that body recomped type of a look where, okay, now we're back down to the same body weight and we look better, or, hey, I'm back down to this weight, but this is kind of how I looked when I was 3 pounds lighter, you know, or 4 pounds lighter or what have you. It's a very patient man's process, I will say. But yeah, just something that, you know, I don't think people touch on enough, you know. Minicuts are just not something that, you know, we should probably utilize for an aesthetic goal, but just kind of use it as part of a gaining phase and stretch out the time that you're going to be doing this gaining phase.
I think if you think about it, right, whether you're mini cutting like short term cut, or it's a long term cut like a contest prep, or you're just in general, your goal is, because everybody's goal in bodybuilding is to look jacked. I want to
Mm-hmm.
look bigger and leaner. That's everybody's goal. You can ask anybody that who's in bodybuilding, that's the goal. That's the overriding goal. How do you get there? Like if you want to put muscle on, and if you weigh, let's say 150 pounds and you want to be 155, 160 pounds of muscle, you can't weigh 150 pounds. You have to gain weight, right? So you have to go past 155, 160 in order to put muscle on. Problem is, people get past a certain look, then it derails them. And then they're like, okay, insecurity creeps up. Now I need the mini cut. So that mini cut becomes premature. So when we think about what's the best ratio, like for bulking and cutting, it kind of depends on a lot of context. But the bottom line is if you want to put muscle on, you got to take your body to a place that you're probably not going to be too comfortable with. I'm not saying you have to get overly fat, but you gotta have to take your body to a place where you're not comfortable the way it looks. Inevitably, in order to make, like, you gain that muscle, let's say, now you still have that extra body fat you just picked up. You have to cut it down at some point. So whether that's 6 months down the road, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, in a sense, everybody's doing the same thing. It's just with different timelines, in a sense, under different contexts. So that's kind of how I look at the mini cuts, because I think sometimes people just get confused by the ratio thing. And I think a lot of times our own insecurities get the best of us. So we look at kind of like, what does the science say with the ratios? And I'm insecure, so I should be doing it this way. But to me, it's more like, if you should be spending way more time not mini cutting, and if you do mini cut, then the question is how long does that mini cut? How long should it be for? Kind of depends on where your body fat level is. Depends on what your experience level is at. Like if you're a beginner, I mean, you're not going to want to do like a hard mini cut, like a 4-week cut, and you dropping someone's calories down by 1,000. Like that's, and they've never experienced that. That's going to be really rough for someone. And the last thing that I want to do as a coach is like kill this young person, inexperienced person, by dropping their calories way down. Now all of a sudden I'm saying, hey, you need to train this way and make sure it's productive. That can be counterproductive, because now it's like not only physically you might be harming them, but mentally and emotionally, putting them through that, it can be kind of traumatizing too. So again, like, it's just, for me, it's like just so multifaceted with this topic. And it's a topic I don't really like to like share. I put a post on Instagram the other day, but I was kind of hesitant about doing it because I knew it was going to be, because it's subjective. It's a subjective topic. And I knew I was going to get bombarded with either lots of questions or debates. So I purposely didn't really go in there and answer people's questions or even get involved in any debates. I was just like, let me just put this context out there. And if it helps those people under that context, great. And if it helps other people to think about it, then that's great too. So for me, I guess it's one of these topics where I'm like, I just get a little bit kind of not frustrated, but it's just like there's just so much to think about, because again, it's so multifaceted. But again, like if you're trying to put muscle on, you have to take your body weight up, and at some point you got to come down. It's just a matter of, okay, when is the right timeline and under what circumstances?
Let me
Alberto,
backtrack it a little bit to
Yeah.
just where Minicuts
Sorry,
kind of
that
came
was all
from.
over the place,
No.
but I figured you'd carry the conversation.
I think it's already been quite useful, because again, fat loss is, I think for most people, just a tool that they've abused the hell out of. That's just how it is for most people. I think especially today, and the Instagram era, where like you can't scroll without like seeing these like beautiful, lean, happy people, right? So, so Minicuts, the first time I had heard about it, this was back like in 2006, 2007. And this was via Lane Norton. And what he was doing is he was doing these 4-week gaining phases, 2-week cuts. He doesn't do this anymore, by the way. And a lot of it was because we, as a whole, it was quite accepted, the whole like P ratio thing. The leaner you are, the more primed you are to to gain lean body mass. We're not going to go over that. There's a great piece on mass on this. Also, Revive podcast with Eric Trexler. That was also a really good piece on that. But as of right now, I think all of us, you can kind of sign off on the fact that you don't have to be lean to gain lean. That most people, right, they end up making their best gains with their at the body comp that they are not necessarily most in love with, right? That's just what we've seen. So again, the 4-week gain, 2-week cut, no one recommends that anymore. That's where it came from. And the way it has been used in recent years, it's just kind of like a bridge between gaining phases. It's like you get to your top in weight, or like in Brad's example, near your top in weight, and then you clean something up for the sake of like continuing to gain afterwards. I did a podcast a while back with Jared Feather, and he said something that I'm like, you know what, this makes a lot of sense. He's like, mini cuts are not for people who are more preoccupied with fat loss than muscle gain, because that's why you're doing it. You're doing it for the sake of just continuously setting yourself up for further growth. So whether it's because, again, you've met your deadline in regards to like, this is as heavy as, we've planned on getting, or like in my case, I wanted to gain like 3-4 more pounds, but it just was not going to happen. So I'm like, you know what, let me cut back down, charge up the appetite, and then it's going to be a lot easier to, put a smaller body through a surplus compared to like me and like, I guess, my full house state. It just requires less calories. So, but again, it's all for the sake of like growth. And I guess the one thing about mini cuts is that, it's not necessarily to like look your best. Like, again, the goal is just to bridge things. And if we're going by the textbook mini cut, it's like fast, it's aggressive. It's not to look fantastic. If we were going to set someone up with like it's time to cash in phase, like it's like, hey, we gained for a whole year, and I think you've earned that fat loss phase. You've resisted the urge to press the fat loss button. Let's cut down. I think we would be in agreement here that the mini cut is not the route that we would advise for most people who just kind of want to get, that summer bod for their first time ever. We wouldn't almost crash diet them, right? If anything, we'd take a pace that probably looks a little bit closer to a contest prep even, correct? Correct, guys?
Yeah, I would agree, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's not for everyone. There's a lot of skills, I think, that basic skills that you have to have mastered before you can take part in any sort of accelerated fat loss phase. So honestly, I'd say 1 in every, say, 10 of my athletes is in that position where it's like, okay, boom, like let's mini cut so that like 6 weeks from now we can get back to like to busting ourselves up with that gaining phase the way we were prior to this. And that's the sole purpose of it. It's not to look like, to have them August abs or anything like that.
Yeah, that's and that, let me pose a question to you, Alberto, because when would you, I mean, obviously you just kind of stated, okay, if someone has gained for like a year, very, very productive in their training, maybe they're setting new PRs, volume PRs, load PRs, etc. You would not want to take that person through a crash type of a mini cut. You would want to be a little bit more smart about it, have it a little bit slower so they retain a lot of that muscle. It would look a lot more like a contest prep diet. But is there a time when you would kind of just say, okay, let's just kind of make this fast, aggressive, and crash, for lack of a better term? Not that I like that term, but it's a little bit more explanatory if people understand it better.
Yeah, it's kind of what it is.
Yeah. When would you use that type of a cut, of a mini cut?
See, the thing with a fat loss phase, a good fat loss phase, is that I think it needs to be paced out in a way so that there's still a good educational component to it. It's like, look, we're gonna, learn how to. Here's a big one: train in that sort of environment, because it's very different to train with enough food versus not training with enough food. So that's why, again, like for me, when I'm taking on someone who's new to the whole contest prep thing, it's like, so how many successful fat loss phases have you had? Because if they said none, it's like, we are not prepping. we need to take our basic fat loss course first. So, it's like learning how to cope in the gym, how to make that mesh with the rest of your life, maybe rearrange some of your habits that maybe were a little bit more conducive when you were gaining, but not so much now that, you're in a fat loss phase. So if we're crash dieting, there's just isn't enough time to learn. And I think anyone who's pretty good at the whole fat loss thing, it's because they understand all their basic principles and they know how to turn on the switch or change those volume dials in the other direction when it is time to go through a cut. So for a beginner, if you've never had at least a handful of successful fat loss phases, we are not mini cutting. No, sir.
How about you, Jeff?
Same. Like, I'm not one who's going to like, I don't like the crash mini cuts in general. I had one gentleman that I took him through a mini cut, but it was more of like a 6-8 weeker. And he's like, Jeff, that just took forever. Like, let's just do this in 2 weeks next time. But I'm talking about someone who's been training for over 20 years and he's done just about as many shows as I've done. So he's well advanced. So he's just like, hey, just let me eat my chicken and my broccoli for 2 weeks and I'm good. We call it a day. Like, but outside of that, like, again, if you're, like Alberto was saying, if you're just not experienced, like, why are you going to put someone through the ringer? And, the positives that come out of that is going to be what? Like, what's going to end up happening is this person's training is probably going to be like in the hole. Recovery is not going to be very good. Life stress could be amplified, because obviously they're eating way fewer calories. So it can impact not just like the bodybuilding, but outside of bodybuilding too. So I just don't see the upsides of doing that to somebody. It just, in most cases, if you're crash dieting like that, you're just doing it for aesthetic purposes. And what is that going to solve? Like, okay, yeah, you might look a little bit better. You might look worse. You might look depleted. But you're really like the pros and cons. I think the cons outweigh the pros in that situation. So I'd prefer it's like, hey, you want to diet X amount of weight in 4 weeks instead of going that fast. Let's just go 8 weeks and go half the pace. And it's probably going to be a lot easier, less invasive, more sustainable, better quality of life, better training, better recovery. And like Berto was saying, the environment for learning is going to be far superior. You're going to be able to absorb what you're actually doing a lot better.
Yeah, I really liked your 2-week chicken and broccoli diet, because really, I have to admit that's how I have done myself in the past. Just trying to slow down the gain. Just a little bit. It's like, okay, I'm not going to track macros here. Maybe I'll just be mindful of my protein. But for probably just here about the next 2 weeks to 19 days, I'm just going to live like a bro. I'm going to eat like salads and I'm going to eat fish, tilapia and asparagus, as Berto likes to put it, and I mean, it's crash-ish in that weight comes down pretty quick, And when I say quick, it's kind of like nothing really happens and then a bunch happens. With me, it's like no weight loss. And then it's like, boom, 3-4 pounds. You know what I mean? But it's in and it's out. It's 2 weeks. It's 20 days. It's something like that. We get the weight loss that we're after. And again, backtracking a little bit, I want to throw this back into your court, Berto. Anecdotally, I've seen on a couple occasions, now this is almost never the case with small females. Well, I shouldn't even say small females, small humans in general. It's hard for them to just drop a bunch of weight eating tilapia and asparagus for 2 weeks. But I digress there. Sorry, I got off my point there. But with bigger people, 190, 200, 210 pounds, it's weird how a little bit of progress usually happens there. For whatever reason, I don't understand it. I've had people say that they can brace better. Like sometimes their tummy is so big that they can't really get air in and brace. I've heard that before. But Berto, why is that when you do kind of a rapid kind of a fat loss, weight loss approach like that, where it's get in, get out, you seem like you're performing just a smidgen better. Sometimes I don't know if your leverage has changed just a little bit and you seem like your strength is just a little bit better. Have you ever experienced that? And do you have any, hypotheses on how that takes place?
I think a lot of it, and this is probably another reason to have those fat loss bridges, is just you can only be working on a certain goal for so long. Even if it's going pretty well. So sometimes I think just when you switch it over to like, okay, now it's a fat loss phase, and you know how that goes. It's like, oh, fat loss must protect my strength, must protect my gains. We get into that, defensive mode. So I think just the motivation to not lose strength, not lose muscle, is something that keeps people performing pretty well.
Yeah.
But also I think sometimes you just, like, I was hitting PRs like left and right when I ended this fat loss phase, but it was just like, okay, I've just been working on this for so long that it's just all starting to kind of look the same. Let me give myself something new and just something like fresh in regards to goals. So I think just the excitement of turning the chapter is something that can really invigorate training, whether it's because you need it or just to kind of avoid being in that getting into that stale phase,
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't even think about that, because sometimes that's the one fear I have about doing a mini cut, is that I don't want to lose my strength. I don't want to lose that performance in the gym. And if I interpret you correctly, it's almost kind of like a placebo in a way. It's like, okay, in order for me to not make that happen, in the back of my mind, I'm going to work a little bit harder.
Got to mentally go there. Exactly.
Yeah. That's a great point. I never even really thought about that.
Hi again. Just wanted to remind you guys that we have a pretty giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The Vault is a place we can organize our best information, pair it with some of our favorite resources, and share it with all of you in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole bunch more. A lot of it is free, some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's at 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.
So, what are some prerequisites that you guys like to see on people before? Again, I'd say for mini cuts, you don't have to use them. Very few people end up using accelerated fat loss at all. And I think usually with our females, we're a little bit wary about that. Like hardly ever, do I have a 150-pound female? It's like, yeah, let's just crash diet you in 5 weeks to like 108, 17. No, something to make note of. But what do you guys like to see, before someone, I guess, is qualified to press the mini cut button? Yeah.
I think if the overriding goal is muscle, then I would like to see an appropriate amount of muscle on an individual, and also experience. I think of like experience level, like where's this person at, like how far into their training career are they, and then from there I kind of look at, okay, on the mental and emotional side, where is this person at with nutrition? Do they have a good relationship with food? And things like that. So those are kind of the two big ones that kind of stand out the most right now for me is those two things.
And you'd say that some people are just perfectly comfortable never switching over to a accelerated fat loss phase. They're like, you know what, the way we've done this, where we've gained for X amount of time, and then we just take 12 weeks to take off the excess. Like for some people that works so well that they're like, you know what, I'm just going to stick to the system, because we don't see a whole lot of, like, I've been fat from bulking, and I've never had trauma. Like, I don't go back and I'm like, oh, shell shock from the overbulk days. But like fat loss messes people up. Like a few wrong turns, and it gets to the point where people can't follow nothing for a while. So I'd say some folks, wouldn't you say, Jeff, are just completely okay with the slow and steady. It's like, you know what? I'm just going to take the slow and steady rate, a way of doing things. I'm not here to like mess myself up.
I think for me too, I think about, okay, if I'm taking someone and I want them to build some muscle, I'm like, let me do it in a way where I don't get this person too fat,
Yes.
Like
yeah.
If it's a little bit more of a methodical, slower approach, then in a sense, if you're going slow, you're only gaining so much every so often. One, like you think of the behaviors that go along with that slower pace. Like again, more opportunity to learn when things are slowed down, right? So if you're not going too fast, you're still in an environment to build muscle, but at the same time, you're learning very good habits. In a sense, it's almost like you're preventative as far as like putting too much body fat on, period. So, because again, it's like, what's the point of going super, super fast, right? You're gaining hard, then all of a sudden you gotta, oh shit, I gotta actually do a mini cut now because I'm going too fast. I clean shit up. Now I gotta go back to gaining. So it's like, let's prevent that as much as possible. So that's why I'm like, okay, if we're in the neighborhood of 6 months, 9 months, maybe even a year or more without even touching any type of deficit, to me, that makes more sense.
Yeah, I like that. It's like the best way to fix a problem is to not have a problem to begin with, right? It's to avoid the problem altogether. It's and what you say. It's exactly those are the people who are most attracted to the mini cuts, are the folks who they bulk themselves up way too quick, and they're like, oh, but it's okay because I know how to do this little fat loss thing, and that just interrupts them before they get anywhere. When like in reality, maybe what they should have done. Like what I've had to do with people, it's like, okay, maybe at like 15, 16% is where they start to feel uneasy about the way they look. It's like, no, bro, let's wait here because this is where the good stuff starts. And you're going to see that you're probably going to look better in 3 to 4 months than you do now.
Exactly.
Right.
So the longer you're in that environment, because you're training in a very conducive environment, you're going to make that body look better over time. So let's say you put on 1 pound, 2 pounds of muscle, which is a decent amount of muscle. Let's say you do that in a year and you're the same body fat percentage. You're going to look superior a year later, even though your body fat percentage is the same. So if you rinse and repeat that even longer, and then let's say you invest, depositing those pennies, right? Like you're investing, you're saving your money a year, 2 years, 3 years, go down the road. You haven't touched a deficit. You're in that nice environment. Then you go to cash in. Okay, let me run a little bit of an extended fat loss phase. And you diet properly down, then all of a sudden your physique is way superior than it used to be. So the same body weights, you're probably like the body weight you were 2 years prior and the same body weight you are now, you just blow it out of the water. So you kind of look at guys like Brian Whitaker, right? Like he only gained a pound of muscle out of over how many years? But every single year he just looks bigger and leaner, even though the body weight's staying the same.
Yeah, and don't you feel like that usually the body kind of like, it's like it almost kind of, at some point, you kind of find that level where your gaining just stops, you know? At least in a lot of experience that I've seen, it's like, okay, we're getting out of this dieting phase. Our goal right now is to get back to normal. Once we're back to normal, we'll start picking our body weight goals and et cetera. It almost always seems like it's like, okay, our goal here is to get you to 210 pounds. It seems like it's always like, and it doesn't matter if we're trying to get the 170 pound bodybuilder to 210 pounds, or if we're trying to get the 150 pound bodybuilder to 180 pounds. It's somewhere about halfway. It just seems like it stops. It's like your body kind of finds this place where you have to be uncomfortable. You have to like eat. And Burrow, you've probably experienced this. You have to eat more food than really you want to in order to get your body past that point. One client comes to mind where we tried to get him to 170 and we basically never made it. We got to as high as 168. And I mean, he was experiencing like digestive issues trying to get to 170 pounds. And I kind of feel like at some point, regardless of what your bulking goal is, your body kind of has its own stopping point somewhere, and then it's just going to be kind of a matter of, okay, do we want to like get extreme to get there? Do we want to, like you said, Burrow, do we want to like do a quick cut, stimulate the appetite a little bit? Maybe get the body primed for putting on a little bit more weight, whether it be muscle, fat, what have you. But I kind of feel like at some point your body's going to fight back and it's not going to want to put that weight on. I know that's not universal. Berto, you did manage to get yourself to about 250 pounds with your squirrel-like metabolism. But nonetheless, I'm sure at that point, you probably had it, you had to work to get there. You had to eat those, what was it, like 7-pound sandwiches that you were eating at some point?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just good for you to feel that, because a lot of physique athletes will go their entire lifting career kind of always being wary of like that hunger boogeyman. You know, so I think it does you some good from a mental standpoint to like have almost the other problem where it's like, man, this eating all the time is kind of getting annoying. And what I find like it does for me, because whenever I switch to my fat loss phase, is that I'm almost like happy to see hunger. It's like, well, this feels kind of nice to like look forward to my next meal, to feel a little empty. Whereas I think anyone who's had a successful fat loss phase where they've gotten themselves pretty lean, you know how it goes. Like the months after, you're just hunger almost freaks you out, almost scares you, kind of sets off the alarms. And again, time away from that, getting to what you described, Brad, I think just does you a lot of good in regards to the whole adherence, in regards to how stressful the fat loss is going to be for you. And like Jeff said, simultaneously, while you're working on all the mental stuff, you're going to be putting on all this muscle that you've never given yourself the chance to put on, because you won't go that far in regards to body weight.
Like for me personally, like when I look back at my situation, which is not going to apply for everybody, but when I look back at the good old days, back in the 80s, 90s, no one was mini cutting. It was like, I'm talking about competitive bodybuilders, like, hey, it's off season, bro. We're freaking eating. I'm going to eat and I'm going to train my ass off, and then I'm going to diet when it's prep time. And that was, in a sense, my ratio was, okay, anywhere like 6 to 9 months of gaining, and then, okay, we got 3 months, 4 months, 5 months of cutting for a show. And then, of course, we didn't know any better as far as taking extended off seasons. So in a sense, the ratio just extends out. And when I look back at my history, and I wish I knew more about dieting and all that at the time, but I always made progress every year. It was like, I look at my photos and all that, my physique got bigger every time. I can't look back on any year where I didn't actually get bigger. And if there might've been 1 or 2, and that's just because I over dieted. I basically chewed up all my muscle. So that kind of right there just tells me, like, looking at my history, like, I don't think it's essential that you have to have mini cuts in your programming in order to maximize your gains. Like for me, it doesn't make sense that, okay, we have to program these in order to maximize your gains. I think, and there's also other things I look at too, just outside of just like, okay, what does maybe the research or science say is like, okay, how do we maximize the gains? But it's like, how is this approach going to impact just life in general? Because I mean, we're human, we're not robots. Like we're not going to be in like 4 walls and that's all we're worrying about is these 4 walls. Like if we have a social life, we have work life. So the weekend rolls around and okay, oh shit, I can't really go out or do this because I'm mini cutting. I can't have a drink. I can't have, I can't eat at a restaurant or something like that. So I think all these things have to take into account as far as like, how we approach mini cuts as well. Like how do we incorporate the social aspect into this part of it? And that's something I take into consideration too when I'm programming mini cuts for people. It's like I have one guy cutting now, again, coming off of an extended gaining phase where in the past he would always want to stay on the leaner side. So I took him out of his comfort zone and had him gaining for a good amount of time. Now we're cutting to see what's underneath. But the way we have his cut going is he's going a little more hard during the week, Monday through Friday. Saturday, Sunday, he's more social with his family, has drinks, goes out and things like that. So he's eating more food on the weekends to kind of be flexible and cater to both kind of the bodybuilding side of things, but also the social and the real life aspect as well.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that, Jeff, because if we would have been holding this podcast like, say, 8 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to have been on it because at that time I was anti-Minicut. I never had anybody run Minicuts. But at the same time, I'm not going to say that, what I was doing was necessarily better because a lot of times I was prescribing gaining phases that were just way too slow. You know, they were way too slow and they were way too restrictive. But my thinking was, you know, basically we want to basically gain the entire time until it's time to prep again, basically. And if we can not put on a whole lot of weight, we're going to be in a better position to diet then. And so I was way too restrictive and way too slow, you know, with my gaining phases. I always, in my mind, used this term gaintaining, which in my mind was let's gain strength in the gym, but maintain body weight, you know, or at least it goes up like, you know, a pound every 2 months or something like that. And so I'm very much 180 to that approach now. Now I actually push for a little bit more weight gain. And like Berto said, use Minicuts as a bridge to get from like, okay, we want to get from now to say, like I used before, 212, or I wanted to get that 150 bodybuilder to 170, but we're going to stretch that out to make that happen over the course of 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, etc. So I utilize Minicuts a lot more, and that's why I feel like I'm much better prepared to have this podcast, obviously, today. But I always kind of tell people, and I'm really surprised, as of late, you know, these last 6 months, when I'm telling people, you know, we need to put some weight on, we need to put some weight on, we need to put some weight on, people are very receptive. I'm really, really surprised at how many of these people are receptive. And so I always tell them, okay, here's the Brad from 8 years ago on the left, gain a pound every 2 months, you know, something way too slow. And then on the other end of the spectrum on the right, we have to look at the people that are on the planet that have the most fat-free mass ever, you know, and those are sumo wrestlers, right? Those guys, they just keep putting on muscle like all the flipping time. But as an aesthetic athlete, obviously we don't want to go to that extreme. So if those are the two opposite ends of the spectrum, right, we want to be somewhere in the middle. And so we always have to kind of deal with insecurities, but at the same time balance that with what we know is the best way to go about it, you know? And I mean, I'll admit it, it's not hard to, it's hard to admit when, boy, I should not have done that to all of my clients and even myself, you know, during those years. But at the same time, it's like, I got to do what I know works best. And so, you know, that's the moral of my long drawn out story there.
You know, in that gaintaining phase or that top end body weight phase, I think right next to Minicuts, like another unicorn of sorts is the whole body recomp thing. Like everyone, you know, you see that guy that's like, hey, you know, just I think I'm gonna stay at 8% and I'm just gonna gain muscle here, and maybe drop a little body fat as I go. And it's like, no, man, like that's what world, right? So, you know, we know what are the usual recomping happens if you're really out of shape, if you were once in shape and you're regaining, right? And then there's like, oh, if you just happen to jump on vitamin S. So those are usually the reasons that people recomp. But I'd say another one that is hardly looked at because it's not very sexy. It's like when you get to those higher levels of body fat, like on the higher end of your, I guess, athletic settling point. That's where I will see it. It's you know, it's like you have enough body fat there where I feel it would make sense that your body doesn't necessarily have to pull from incoming food. It can totally pull from what you have there already because you have plenty of it, right? And you'll see people literally stay at the same body weight for an extended period of time. And then like this area gets harder and you're like, am I seeing something? Like, oh no, that's definitely harder now. And then like for some reason, you know, they're not flopping over their shorts nearly as much. You see the recomp happening when you know, you're at those high end body weights and you're progressing at a pretty predictable rate with your in the gym metrics. So I think that's another perk to like not necessarily calling uncle on your fat loss phase prematurely, because we do see that quite a bit, and I know you guys have as well, correct?
It's very rare on my end because we don't have very many athletes that get there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's very rare that we have that type of an athlete, you know. How about you, Jeff? You'd see that very often?
Yeah, I don't get that people that are that heavy too often. But when I do, yeah, usually it's like you start to see them improve. You're like, well, scale's kind of saying the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
but visually they're changing, especially if they're just starting to weight train. And then just kind of naturally, I think people too, like when they come to us in that condition, then they get more mindful about food choices and things like that. So naturally, I think calories might be coming down just without even tracking, just from the behavior shift. But that's kind of the things I kind of see with that. But like you said, Brad, it's not commonplace where I work with someone like that.
Yeah, I remember I was seeing that on Andrea for a minute there when she was, doing all her training and like eating just massive amounts of food. It's like she stayed the same body weight, but just like it's like you're looking better somehow, even though like bodybuilding wasn't necessarily at the forefront of her training. When I reach my top in body weight, it's like I'll just hang there, but I'm like, oh man, like that vein used to be out sometimes, and now it's out all the time, So
Well, I think we've talked amongst each other, and we're like, hey, remember this time, like 3 or 4 years ago when I was 190? I mean, look at the way I look at 190 now than I did 3 years ago.
yeah.
So over time, like we talked about earlier in the podcast, like the training is what's going to make the most changes with our physique. So a lot of times just being consistent with the training and not getting overly focused with the aesthetic side and thinking that, cutting has to be an essential part of the process. Unless maybe you're just like super uncomfortable, like your body fat level, let's say it's a little bit elevated and you're just super unhappy or uncomfortable, then in some cases it kind of makes sense. Like, okay, let's clean this person up, get them to a little bit more of a happy place. Once that's successful, okay, now let's kind of go with the approaches that we've been kind of talking about, like focusing more on, hey, let's actually focus more on training and maybe maintaining weight or maybe going back up in weight if it's appropriate to do so.
And it always works out that way, doesn't it? It's like the successful mini cuts are always those ones where people are just a little bit uncomfortable. It's like, you know what? I've gotten just a little bit too heavy here for my liking. It's almost never the person that's like, you know what? I can't see my abs as well as I used to, or I'm not as shredded as I was, That person that wants to do a mini cut, almost never are their mini cuts very successful. I feel like enough things are still messed up in order for the mini cut to be effective. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, Jeff, I just kind of wanted to expand upon what it was that you were saying there. One thing that I know is going to be a question that arises from this is, when do we use cardio for a mini cut, right? Because there's a tool. It's a tool that is there, So, Bert, do you ever use cardio for mini cuts for yourself, for your clients?
This reminds me, I think it was one of those fat loss shows where they would take them on a cakewalk and they would, what was it? Yes, like they're gonna hold a piece of cake that's like 700 calories while walking 700 calories just to see, like, I guess the difference. It's like, it's a lot easier to not eat something than it is to like, use the energy, right? So I think generally speaking, if you're going to create big deficits, because by the time someone they're ready for a mini cut, like we've decided this is the best way. This is a solid decision right now within the context of your situation. They probably are pretty good at training in the gym, so we want to protect that. So we don't want to create a whole lot of that deficit via the exercise. I think kind of going back to the cakewalk, which was a horrible thing to do that to that person, but it really drew home the point that it's just a lot easier to not eat 700 calories than it is to burn 700 calories. Like right now with my current mini cut, we have like 3 weeks of like going pretty hard on it again. I don't want to do cardio. It's like it's cold outside, and I want to save it all for the energy. So for all my energy for the gym. So we've been primarily doing it via diet. Although to an extent you can negotiate ratios, but if you're going to be running a pretty assertive fat loss phase, you're probably going to want to do that mostly via diet, which again is another argument for like, hey, how about we just take that good old slow and steady approach? It's like, look, it's going to take twice as long, but you're not going to have to be starving, which, again, does things to people mentally. And again, you have time to further sharpen up your fat loss skills, because now instead of, dieting for 7 weeks, it's a 12-week fat loss phase. And we're able to, again, implement a bit more of a educational component to the whole experience, rather than just focusing on getting there.
I think a lot of it's context dependent too, on the individual. Like for myself, like if I'm going to run a mini cut, I can't rely on foods cut as much because I'm very sedentary and I don't require a lot of food. I could hold 200 pounds on 2,100 calories probably. So where am I going to go from there? Down to 1,500, 1,400? That's going to be, I could do that maybe for a week, but then after that, I'm going to be like, I'm ready to eat my arm off. So it makes more sense for me to maybe move more, and then kind of see where that takes me. And I think if it's done in a strategic way, you can preserve your training. There's easy forms of movement you can do: walking, light cycling. You could even think about, okay, how am I going to balance out the supply and demand aspect of everything? So let's say someone's training 5 or 6 days a week in the weight room. Okay, take it down to 4. You can still program in a way where you can maintain muscle, because it's not going to require as much energy to maintain muscle as to build muscle. So even if you're cutting volume down a little bit, you're not going to atrophy, especially if the rate of loss is appropriate. If you're losing quick and you drop your training demand down, then I'd be a little more worried about it. But again, it's that rate of loss that I think is really important to holding on to muscle. So it just kind of depends on the person's situation. A construction worker, a big male, let's slash food down. Let's not have him do cardio. It just depends on a lot of context. But I agree, though. It's like easier to maybe not eat something than it is to power through 700 calories of cardio. That's going to take a lot of time and energy to do that. But that's kind of my thoughts. It's like I like to examine each individual. It's like I dive into the context and see what kind of makes the most sense from a practical standpoint as far as their ability to execute in a least invasive way.
One thing with a mini cut,
more.
well, you're going to see transient losses in performance. Like that's just it. Like there's just, and you have to be okay with that. And you have to know that like, it's fine. Like you're not disappearing. And a whole lot of people are not ready for that. Like right now I'm going pretty assertive, and I know that, hey, it's like, hey bro, don't try to just match up these reps. So you're matching up these reps that you were doing earlier. It's like, just kind of let it go. Cause I think, if anything, like I think with fat loss in general, they tend to often train harder than they need to, cause at this point it's more like defensive lifting. And if you are mini cutting, it is really defensive lifting. Like you are there to maintain. Whereas with a slower fat loss phase, it's like you might still hit a few PRs. I have not hit no PRs since I've done this. I've basically
that's probably a mistake people make, is that when they do a fast mini cut, and again, if it's appropriate for the person, but a lot of them make the mistake of trying to train with the same volume, same intensity. And they might get away with it for a week, but in the second week, they're like, holy shit, I just hit the wall. Yeah. And then there's that mental freak out that goes along with that. So I think, it just makes sense. Like if you think from a supply and demand perspective, you drop your calories way down, well, now your overall supply goes way down. So if you have the same demand, something's going to take a hit. So it's like, it's okay if you bring some of that demand down as far as like your training. Like if you knock off 20% of your volume, nothing bad is going to happen. If anything, you're going to balance out your overall fatigue levels, and you're going to maintain your ability to perform, your ability to keep your loads up, the ability to recover really well after those sessions. So you're going to keep everything in a nice balance that way. I think a lot of times people make that mistake with harsh mini cuts, and also contest prep too. When you get deep into contest prep, it's kind of the same demand that we're under, but yet people make the same mistakes of trying to do too much. And I think that's where, I really try to stress the emphasis of rest days, the emphasis of sleep, and all those types of things, while we're kind of taking our body through harsh periods like that.
Yeah, and this really kind of circles back to our discussion that we had earlier, Berto, when you were talking about the conditions for a mini cut, and also with Jeff in context, I mean, perfect condition, in my opinion, there's like no cardio happening at all. Good amounts of body fat are there. Training performance is stellar, and it's kind of a no-brainer at that point. When there's no cardio happening, you can institute any form of cardio, and it's going to have a good effect. Now, the opposite of that, I am never going to let somebody do a mini cut when they're doing 3 spin classes and 9 walks on their dog every week. Where are we going to go? How are we going to be able to expend more calories when you're already doing that?
You're going to jog with a dog.
Yeah, and that's, again, push back. How many more calories are you burning when you're jogging with the dog versus walking with the dog, So yeah, and again, size of the person, the size of the human, makes a big difference. If they're a small human and they're doing spin classes and they're walking their dog, and they're not uncomfortable with their body fat, you know what? I'm sorry, I don't care. This is not the environment for a mini cut. And if we try, we're setting you up for failure, is kind of the bottom line. You're going to beat yourself up because you couldn't do it. You're not going to like what you see because it's probably not going to work. And at the same time, you're going to kill yourself, So again, kind of getting back to the conditions for a mini cut, one end of the spectrum, good training. I'm not going to say high amounts of body fat, but at least you're a little bit uncomfortable with your body fat. No cardio for the most part. And it's a bridge. It's a bridge to get you from where you are now down a little bit and then back on the road to where it is that you're going. And then on the other end of the spectrum, well, I'm not going to beat a dead horse. I just went over that pretty in depth.
On the mental side, I think in regards to to-dos, I like to have a person at the point where they can kind of auto-regulate their intake. They can eat that buzzword intuitively at this point. So it's like, hey, we were able to put together these long-term gaining phases without necessarily being able to track everything, and we're able to stretch them out to a reasonable amount of time. You don't get too fat. You make it look like you were tracking, but you really weren't. And then on the flip side, before we do the mini cut, it's like same thing. We have to have had a few successful fat loss phases as well, where I was able to tell you like, hey, you know what, these next 12 weeks, I want you to go ahead and bring me anywhere between 10 to 15 pounds. And they are able to do that without necessarily tracking. And then we can talk about like cutting the time in half. But again, there's like a lot of skills up here that I think you have to have sharpened. Like Jeff was talking about the training. Like right now, since I'm being pretty assertive, I'll leave a set. I'm like, you know what? That last set that's scheduled, I'm not doing that. Like that is it. Like, nope, that's not going to do me any good. That's just going to set me up for like my second push exercises of the week. They're just going to be wrecked. And that's something that realistically, I'd say 5-7 years ago, I wasn't necessarily able to think ahead. All I could think about was that last set that was kind of garbage, how I need to go back in there and redeem myself, as opposed to like, bro, you're running on a kind of like on a little loading screen right now. It's like, don't be pressing all the keys on the keyboard. That's literally all another set would have done at that point. So yeah, you need to have that bodybuilder's intuition, I think, before you can put yourself through a mini cut / semi, I guess, crash diet sort of deal.
Yeah, and I think Jeff has really kind of mastered that with his diet. Period. It's like he
Yep.
He knows when the water is boiling, and it's like, okay, the water is boiling at level 7 on the oven. Is it really going to help to turn it up to 10? Yeah. I mean, what are you going to do? Boil the water more? Yeah. And I think that's something that you can't read that in a textbook. You can't teach that. You can't. That's not something that there's evidence out there. You have to have lived that. You know what I mean? And I mean, Lord knows that Jeff's lived that, and he's gone and done those sets where he tried to just take the water boiling more, you know, and he's left it on the table and set himself up for the next session. So I can look at Jeff. He's ready.
Yeah, well, sometimes I forget that I am like, because I've been doing it for so long. It's just kind of like, I think it's intuitive, but it actually is a learned skill, but it's gone through the experiences. So I've kind of I've learned to slow my thinking down. Because I think when I was younger, like I was like a lot of other people. I want to get jacked now, and I want to get shredded now. I want everything now. So I've had to learn to slow down, take a step back, and look through a wider lens. And the best way I kind of describe like the skill set that I have is like again, the supply and demand concept. Like everything there's a demand and there's a supply. The supply for us is the food level, it's the rest days, it's your sleep. Like that's the three primary routes for supply. The demand is the training itself, the cardio, the step count, life stress. If you're in a caloric deficit, that's a demand, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm always thinking like, how can I balance these things out? Like obviously, if you're in a fat loss phase, the demand needs to outpace the supply because we're trying to get fat loss, but you don't want that pace to be too far out in front because you're going to get yourself in hot water. You're going to be boiling at 10, not 7. You're going to be boiling. So it's like, okay, how do we bring that down? Okay, that's where maybe refeeds come into play. Like, yeah, they may or may not be essential for fat loss, like for better fat loss, but they sure as hell could bring your overall demand down and temporarily give you relief so you can make sure your training performance is elevated, you're recovered, you're able to take your wife out on a nice date. You know, it's like these things matter because it keeps your overall stress level in harmony. So just from that perspective, like I try to take a step back, slow my thinking down, think from a big picture perspective, and think about, okay, if that demand is elevated, what's the impact going to be? How's that going to impact today? How's it going to impact tomorrow? How's it going to impact next week? Because the decisions that you're making in the moment, they have a consequence, either positive or negative. So a lot of times as bodybuilders, we get too caught up in what others are doing or saying, and we kind of forget about what we're actually experiencing. So I think it's super important for people, whether you're mini cutting, you're trying to gain muscle, whatever, take notes. Take notes on how things go. Like take notes while you're training. Like a 3x10 doesn't always feel like it's not the same as a 3x10. Like it could be super easy today, but it could be super hard tomorrow. Why is it easy today? Why is it hard tomorrow? Like you got to weigh these things out. Same thing with fat loss phases. You know, well, why am I struggling on my diet? Why is the adherence bad? Why aren't I progressing? Is it the protocol? Is it my ability to execute the protocol? If the protocol isn't, I can't execute it, then the question is why? Is there something that needs to be changed? So, I mean, these are just the things that kind of go through my head when I'm like thinking of my own journey and how I kind of pace things out. It's more from that supply and demand perspective on a grand scale and an acute scale.
And it's a lot, but you process it quick. You learn to make the better decisions right then and there. Like, you know, you probably have altered workouts all the time, like in the midst of it. And it's something that I think it just comes with the experience. You have to actually mess up a little bit.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. You have to embrace mistakes. Like you have to welcome them as long as you're not, getting hurt or whatever. But it's kind of like, this is an analogy I always use. Like I tell my son, hey, don't touch that. Don't touch that. Like he knows dad's telling him not to touch it. So he knows, okay, that's the right thing to do is not to touch it, but he's going to do it anyway. And that when he does, that's where he like, okay, it really ingrains, okay, dad was right. Yeah. Now I know. Okay. So it's okay, if you're making mistakes. So even if you run a mini cut phase and you run it aggressively and it turns out like a shit show, well, now you know. Now you know. And maybe those guys at 3DMJ, they said maybe instead of 6 weeks, it should be 12 weeks. Now I know what they were kind of talking about.
And leaving that one set on the table and not doing it. That was a quote I think that you had, Berto, is that that one set that you left is never going to break you, but that one set that you went a little bit too far could really put you in a big hole. I don't remember exactly what the quote was, but that's that would be an appropriate quote right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I used to tell Berto, he won't shrink.
Yeah. Yeah.
He won't shrink.
Yeah. When it comes to muscle, it's like you have to, like on the training side, anyways. It's like it's metabolically so expensive. Like to build that thing up is so much work for your body. It's not going to knock it down, like unless it absolutely is like, okay, I think we don't need this anymore. It makes no sense. So I always surprise myself when it comes to general fat loss phases, like how little I can do while still maintaining the amount of muscle that I do have. So, but again, I've messed it up every single way you can think of. So there you have it. I think part of the reason that I bulked for so long that one time, first of all, I was training with a bunch of like enhanced guys, and I'm competitive, so I'm like, I'm gonna get big too then. But also I kept having these little fat loss. I'm like, okay, I'm going a little fat loss phase, and then I'd do it for like 2 weeks, and I'd be way too aggressive, and I'm like, oh no way, like fat loss, you just go catabolic, you lose it. So I've been on that side where like I was too assertive and had to bail out right away. And I've graduated all the way to this point where like literally like I can, cut my intake to amounts that I'd rather not say, because then everyone's going to follow and do it too. And like, I'm good and I'm able to manage that. But again, it took a lot of learning how to drive this car, what I'm prone to as a human. And yeah, like sometimes it's not the answer that I want, especially on the training side of things. When Jeff bails out on something right now during his prep, it's not like it's exact. He'd rather be hitting a PR right now, 100%. But that's not what's going to set him up for many good workouts down the road. So, yeah, it's one thing about fat loss phases. They make your body a little bit more transparent. They make you a little bit more transparent as a person too. I feel like, I know every contest prep, I learn which ones are like my buttons. And it's to say that they're not there in the off season would be pompous for sure. It's because like they're still there. It just takes a little bit longer to get to that point. So same thing with training stress. It's like sometimes you learn that you're using too much volume. You're like, oh shoot, I am way beyond what I need. Because that U-shaped relationship with volume. It's like a lot of people, they find themselves on this side. And it's just when you cut, it's just less forgiving. It's almost like an upside down V. And it's like, oh, okay, let me back up over here. So that is one of the, I guess just a side thing, a benefit from a fat loss phase. You kind of, you get real with how much you can actually recover from, because a surplus will mask a lot of errors when it comes to your training setup, 100%.
Yeah, my notebook here's empty, you guys. I've crossed off everything that I had. Do you guys have anything to add there, Jeff?
I don't have a notepad, and I'm the guy who said take notes, huh? No. No, I think I said my piece. For now, as far as mini cuts, maybe my thought process changes in a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, but I think I've covered everything that I've been thinking about mini cuts, the last couple of years.
Yeah, we didn't do a good job selling them to people, but that was kind of what it's like the same thing with the prep, right? We're always telling guys like, okay, hold up. Like it's not as glamorous as like you might have seen on TV. It's like there's some things to think about, and I think we did a good job with that today, guys. It's like let's slow this down for you and tell you what you're really in for. So mini cuts, I don't think you need them. I think when it comes to fat loss hierarchy, it's like contest prep, and then after is like the mini cut, and then below that's going to be like the general fat loss phase. And to be honest, I've seen a lot of awesome physiques that have just made a living off like the general fat loss phase. And I know you guys can attest to that as well.
Yeah, so do we leave it there, guys?
Yeah. Like I said, we did a good job selling this or not selling this, which was kind of the point anyways. So yeah, think twice about what you do with yourself. Don't chew more than what you're actually ready to swallow. Like at this point. Yeah. So yeah. All right, guys. Thank you for joining us. Me and Jeff are going to go starve, and I think Brad is too. So we'll go do that now.
What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler, where we cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or an athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, in audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits for most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the Products tab. Thanks for your time, and thanks for listening.